Hi, my name is Padma Dharmata, and I was asked a question by my friend Lewis, but I wanted to answer in a way that I could share easily, but also share with everybody. And the question was about my spiritual awakening. Was there something the straw that broke the camel's back? What was that straw? What was that final thing that caused your search? Well, to begin the story, I grew up in a very religious, super conservative family. I was taught the concept of God and heaven and hell probably from birth. But I remember being homeschooled well before preschool age and being taught, about what this God is and the Christian concept of God at least. And there's this man in the sky who's watching everything you do and knows every single thought that you have. And if you don't do everything right according to him, then you'll suffer for eternity. Hell, fire, and brimstone, all of that good stuff. My dad was an associate pastor for a church. One of the things that we did together, and again, at this point, I'm 4 years old, my dad was in charge of ministering to the community, and he would take these gospel tracts and, we would knock on doors, we would walk through neighborhoods, knocking on people's doors, handing them these gospel tracts and telling them about this God and how, they're doomed to go to hell for all of eternity. And, unless they accept this Jesus as salvation, then they could be saved and go to heaven for all of eternity and, be safe from the suffering for all of eternity. And so, and I was good at it, and I was 4 years old. It was the only thing I was ever taught, such as, it goes with children. Your parents teach the children, what to believe, and that becomes your world, that becomes your bubble. I never questioned it. There was nothing else. One day we were at this church, our church, that was in like an old Victorian home. So, had a front door and a porch and things like that. It was actually in a home. And, but nobody lived there. It was converted into a church. And one day my dad and I were there by ourselves, and I'm not really sure what we were doing, but we were the only ones there. It was upstairs, downstairs. My dad was downstairs, and I had been upstairs and was coming down the stairs. I heard a knock on the front door of the church, and my dad opened up the door and answered to whoever was at the front door as I was coming down the stairs. He was completely unaware that I was behind him or listening to the conversation that ensued. And this woman was at the door and holding one of these gospel tracts that my dad and I would take around the town. And she was yelling and she was cussing and she was mad, and she was yelling at my dad, furious about why would somebody put this on her car or her door or something, knowing that she was, insert the title of another religion. I don't remember what religion. And she was going on and on and on and on and on. And often I do recall that my dad even took these tracts to other churches, people of other belief systems. And all of a sudden there was this light bulb moment. And I suddenly began to question, like, wait a minute, is there some other God? Are there other gods? I had never even had the idea or the thought or the conversation that there could possibly be another way of life, that could possibly be some other God. Then I began to question, is there some other God that's actually the right God? And because we're serving this God, that because I believed in the wrong God, that now I'm going to go to hell? Or, and this very profound thought process of, what if these got this very profound thought process of, what if these gods are the wrong God? Just the thoughts came. And that was the spark that lit an awakening process of the course of the rest of my life. And how powerful at 4 years old for that moment to happen. And I'm not sure if I'm explaining it very well, but but that that moment defined the rest of my life. That regardless of everything and anything that my parents or the church ever taught me, I always came back to questioning, was this actually the right thing? And I now felt compelled that there must be other things for other people to believe and follow other things. There must be something else out there, and how could I ever be sure that this was going to be the right thing? And I would have conversations with my dad and ask him, how can you be sure? How can you really be sure that you can be saved, that you're saved by Jesus? And he would say, well, when you're really saved, you'll know. And I never knew that I was saved, no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I prayed, no matter how much I went to church, no matter how much I begged and I pleaded, I never felt sure that I was safe, that I was saved. This created a complex within me of having night terrors at the age of 7 years old, having this immense fear that I was going to suffer for all of eternity. I would have these nightmares and night terrors that, Jesus was returning and I was being selected to go to hell. And I would have these terrors of hell and demons and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as a child, this was the environment that I was to live in. I didn't have an option. So I continued to live under this belief system and continued to try to abide by it as much as possible, but always felt this resistance in me. And my parents saw this resistance and, fought very hard to push me into it as much as possible. To the point of, if I wasn't feeling well, of being forced to go worship and pray to, this God to heal my stomach ache, to the point that it would just break me down to tears because I just needed to be taken care of, not be forced to, practice in some worship. It affected my entire childhood to the point that by the time I was a young adult, I definitely had an anxiety about my spiritual being. When I was a teenager, my parents moved our family across the country into a Pentecostal camp, which I now refer to as a cult because it's very much what it was. But at that time, I didn't know it. And we moved to this camp in Virginia and became a part of this church, and it became even more confining, even more religious, even more oppressive than even the life that I had been living under my parents for so many years. And we spent a year at this cult. I was 15 to 16 at this time. And it was both a very powerful and profound experience in the sense that I did witness a lot of things that did add to my spiritual experiences, but it did also become the worst year of my life, a very dark year, which is very intense to say as a teenager even. So it was not a good year for me as a human. And at the end of that year, my parents decided to divorce, and my dad stayed. My mom came back to our hometown. And at first I stayed with my dad. I struggled with these feelings, but ultimately was convinced that the right thing was this religion. And again, it was the only thing that I knew. And even though I knew there were other religions, never knew those thought patterns. I never knew those belief systems. So I continued to feel compelled that this was the way to go. And so I stayed with my dad and tried really hard to gain his acceptance and his approval, and, decided that I was going to be a missionary and a Christian teacher and etc. And there was a breaking moment there where no matter how much my dad had pushed me, convinced me that I was a sinner because he could see these doubts that I had about the Christianity. And then, over the years and years and years and years of anxiety and night terrors and etc., finally got to a point culminating to the point that, we're in this moment, and even that decision wasn't good enough for him. And I can't really remember exactly what happened in that moment, but I began to realize, like, oh shit, So no matter what I do, it's never going to be good enough. So I decided to move back to Kentucky with my mom. And that summer was, in some sense, a liberating summer for me. At 16 years old, my mom was working like double time as a single mom with 3 kids, and was working as a bartender. And my sisters were back and forth between our parents' houses. And based on this experience with my dad, I had decided to not go back to live with my dad. And the more that I was growing into my own person, the more resistance that I felt for my dad. And so I began to really discover myself as a person, discover my own likes and interests, and because I had grown up in such an oppressive environment, be able to really just open up and flourish. And without a parent really involved in my life, I began to work. I bought a car. I began to make friends for perhaps the first time ever. I began to date someone who later I married. So one night that summer, I had stayed up all night on the phone with a friend and was watching TV, and happened to come across a yoga program coming on the Oxygen channel at 5 a.m. And I just began to watch what they were doing, and it looked really interesting. And the guy teaching, his name is Steve Ross, had some very interesting things to say, and was talking about ancient yogis. And, something really resonated deep within my soul, and the yoga practice looked fun. So I began to do the postures with the program, and it was something that I loved so much, even though I didn't have a yoga mat. I was just practicing on the carpet, that I began to wake up every morning at 5 a.m. to do yoga with Steve Ross, and began loving it so much that I began to seek out other yoga programs, and was doing hours of yoga every day. Until the program with Steve Ross ended, and it really left me lacking like a teacher. Something resonated hardcore with it, that I'd never been exposed to in my life, and I couldn't place exactly what it was. But I spent the next many years searching for a yoga to replace that, searching for a yoga teacher, something that resonated in the way that yoga resonated. And as a teenager, I was traveling all over Kentucky and parts of Tennessee to find that yoga, and not really finding it until many years later. So off and on, I'm exploring yoga in different facets, but also still struggling with Christianity as the years go on. And as I married my husband, ex-husband now, and we had a daughter, and then divorced. At the point that we divorced, 21 years old and divorced, which was a struggle within myself, but also I recognized in that relationship that I had lost myself, and had begun to struggle so much that I really just wanted to be happy. I wanted to find out who I was in this life. And I recognized that I had been living my life as a reflection of everyone around me, whether my parents, and then going directly from my parents to a husband. And so now, being freshly separated, I just wanted to find me. I almost immediately began to date another person. And this relationship was a very intense, very fun relationship. A very dysfunctional relationship, and there were certainly flags right away that I didn't really see, or perhaps chose to ignore, and fell deeply in love with this person, and had plans to marry, and had this whole life planned out. And he was living with me, and he would work during the day, and he would come over at night, and we'd do things together and spend time together. It was a very intense relationship, very fast, very intense relationship. And so one day he decided to enlist in the military, and at the point that he went off to basic training, it was a very challenging time, because you're also not allowed to talk talk to the person while they're in basic training, at least for the first couple of weeks. And then, you get periodic phone calls. And so while that was very challenging and there was lots of anxiety already going on, and, of course I have this anxiety that I brought with me from my childhood. And then almost as soon as he was shipped off to basic training, I found out that he had been married the whole time, and it completely devastated me. I actually met up with the wife and we were both blown away, and very cordial with each other, but sat down and discussed the details. It was kind of just this mind-blowing moment. She had no idea, I had no idea, and apparently there was a third person that he was supposedly engaged to. And we had these plans of, once he was stationed at his first military base, that I would come and live there and we would get married. And I was under the impression that he was getting a divorce, and at no point was he ever getting a divorce, but he was living these multiple lives, and ended up being a pathological liar, and a very good one at that. And to keep it very short, it blew a hole through my heart and created the deepest pain I had experienced in my life. And it sent me spiraling into this abyss of darkness. I don't want to say depression, because I don't want to misuse that word, but perhaps you could call it depression. I call it it was a very dark period of time for me. My chest literally physically hurt always. My diet consisted of caffeine and white rum. I would come home from work, I would sit with a bottle of rum and, drink and write and try and heal and take care of my child at the same time. I can't even explain how it affected me. This turned into a massive amount of anxiety that turned into agoraphobia, that turned into not leaving my house at all except for to go to work. I wouldn't even go to the grocery store unless it was like the middle of the night. I wouldn't hang out with friends. I was afraid of the world. I had had my world blown apart and questioned my reality, that someone I trusted and loved so much could have fooled me so easily. And not only that, but I felt responsible for the devastation of his family with his wife and their kids. Even though I do recognize now that I had no awareness that this was going on and it wasn't my fault. But in that period of time, I felt responsible. And it was a horrendous guilt, but also questioning everything in my life, questioning my reality, questioning all of the relationships around me, and is there anybody that could ever be trusted? And this turned into, massive anxiety, to the point that I just had to physically remind myself to breathe. And what felt like every single breath of the day, reminding myself, okay, breathe in, okay, breathe out. And that turned into, nights of sleeplessness, that turned into, trying to force myself to go to sleep just to escape the anxiety. And there's so much that I feel like I could talk about. But again, just trying to keep this condensed, that turned into, a night of just not being able to handle the pain anymore, of having so much anxiety, so much terror, so much fear. And, having also spent years going back and forth, I would never say that I crossed over into not believing in God, but just like not ever really knowing what was right, and constantly praying out to this only God I've ever known for help, and never really feeling like there was any help there. And so this particular night, I was overwhelmed with anxiety. I was overwhelmed with grief. I was overwhelmed with pain. I was experiencing the worst panic, the worst fear, the worst anxiety of my entire life, coupled with the fact that, I felt like I was going to hell. And so I, was completely broken down, and, was just lying in my floor and just crying so loud, screaming, begging God, please take this from me. If there's anything in you, if there is any God that exists, like, please take this from me. This God that I prayed to my entire life. If there's nothing else I can ever have in this life, please take this from me. And it would not go away. And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed all night long, and I begged for anything to be relieved of even a fragment of what it was that I was experiencing. And it would not go away. And so I accepted that as my answer. And so I sat up and I told myself that if there is no answer from God in this state, if no amount of crying or begging or pleading is reaching the heart of God, then I was going to live my life my own way. Everybody else in the world, from my perspective, was living their life the way that they wanted to. And so I said, fuck God, fuck religion, fuck Christianity. And I walked away from all of it. And I began to live my life again. And the areas of suppression that I experienced at that time because of religion and Christianity was I wasn't allowing myself to fully experience relationships, especially in sexuality. And so I began to explore that. And so that was a summer of exploring relationships with people, without having the bind of relationships, but just having fun and not being compelled or terrorized by the thought that there's some God on the other side watching to punish me. And that began a journey of awakening. That began my journey of spirituality. That led to one awakening after the other. I did begin to unbrainwash myself of the things that I had learned from Christianity, but also not knowing where else to look still at this point. I did go back to the Christian Bible and begin to look at it with a beginner's mind to seek out any wisdom or just to be able to start a fresh life. And I began to see things with a different light, and began to really understand that this life is meant for experience and enjoyment. And I began to live my life that way. And I began to just want to live a life of love. And Mother Teresa became one of my heroes, for lack of a better word. And there's a quote that I lived by, or tried to live by, that says, "There are many in the world who are dying for a piece of bread, but there are many more dying for a little love." And I felt that in my soul, and I wanted to give love for every being that I could. And I soon found myself in another relationship, and after about 2 years in that relationship, it began to become very toxic. While this particular relationship did help me heal and mend a lot of wounds, it then passed its course of time, and began to not be a helpful relationship. And at the end of that relationship, the day that we broke up, we were in this horrible argument, and these dark thoughts began to penetrate me, and I caught myself thinking that I didn't deserve to be loved. But I caught myself thinking that, and I stopped everything, and I went out to my front porch, and I was smoking cigarettes at the time, And, I smoked a cigarette and really just started sitting with where I was at in my life and who I was and where I was going. And this particular relationship was over, but we were still living together. And, I told myself that I do deserve to be loved and that I don't want to be in any relationships anymore. I want to be in a relationship with myself, to get to know myself, to love myself. Maybe I would have friendships or romantic encounters or whatever, but I was not going to be in a relationship anymore. I needed to learn to love myself. The very next day, a friend had invited me to go to a yoga class at a local studio that had just opened up. And of course, I'm still in this 7-year-long search at this point, a passive search of looking for a yoga teacher or a yoga that I resonate with. And so the next day I go into this yoga class, and of course I have social anxiety still that I'm working through. And the friend who invited me ended up not showing up, in which typically I would leave and not do the thing by myself. But I was very drawn to doing this yoga, and so I went ahead and I took the class, and it was a hot yoga class. And this bearded man taught this class, and in the middle of the class said, "Who here feels like they deserve love?" And I heard that thought pop back up that says, I didn't deserve to be loved. And then he said, "Everyone here deserves to be loved." And it really reached into my heart in almost an eerie way that he echoed the very same conversation that I had with myself the night before. This ended up being Billy Barefoot Yogi, who is now my partner of 10 years. That class turned into 100 classes, a million classes, an innumerable amount of classes. And I can continue taking yoga classes with Billy. So after about a month of taking yoga classes from Billy, he invited me to meet at a park, and that is where we actually had our first conversation face to face. And it was a very interesting meeting. We met and sat beneath a tree, and I naturally just began to open up and told him my entire life story. And, he told me his story, and I just kept hearing this voice in my heart that was telling me that Billy was my teacher. And, I asked, "The teacher of what?" And that heart voice said, "He's going to teach you how to love yourself and how to love the world." And I would absolutely say that has been what has occurred in the past 10 years. It has been a journey of learning myself, loving myself, and loving other people. In what became of our relationship, we became, for lack of a better word, catalysts for each other's awakening. And meeting Billy, and Billy will say the same thing about meeting me, we came together and created a space for each other to just shift. And I really began to heal everything that I'd gone through in my life. Billy was that, I forgot to say this a minute ago, Billy was that spiritual teacher that I'd been looking for 7 years. And I had felt him in my heart for my entire life. I've been a writer my entire life, and that has been how I heal. And whenever I would write things in my life, I recognized that who I'd been writing to all my life was Billy. This resonance I felt in my soul of this person that I was always talking to, that naturally felt like I wanted to connect with, and never had the ability to. My twin flame soulmate, but also my teacher. And I, from there, began to just dive deep. I dove headfirst into a path to awakening, where I'd already had several moments of awakening or several shifts of awakening. I guess for some people it happens very click, very overnight, and for other people it happens very incrementally. And I think I'm a person who's happened very incrementally. Whenever I met Billy, I dove headfirst into this path of awakening, as you might call it. In the beginning, Billy began to train me to teach yoga, and I began teaching yoga very quickly, but simultaneously began studying the spiritual side of yoga and resonated very heavily with the teacher Paramahansa Yogananda, and read his autobiography and even began to take his Kriya Yoga lessons through the Self-Realization Fellowship, and began to study pretty much anything that I could get my hands on, just like at a rapid rate, just like absorbing all this information that I could find. It was like for the first time in my life that everything was clicking into place and things were making sense. And in reading this book by Yogananda and going through the lessons, I began to really see that anything is possible in this life. And to the point that there's just like nothing that my mind doesn't believe, because I know it's possible. And I think if anything, that's maybe been the biggest thing that's happened to me in my awakening journey. Perhaps it's the biggest awakening that I've ever had because of that thought, because of that belief, because of that egg cracking open. I understand how things can happen, how miracles can happen, how manifestation can happen, how other realms, other dimensions can happen. Not to sound kooky, but there's a deeper understanding there that I don't know that I can find words to really explain what it is that I mean. And so through that, I began to purge certain ideas, certain social norms, and just kind of in some sense wanted to like strip myself of everything I'd learned in this life, even further than I did with unbrainwashing Christianity some years before this. And I began by shaving my head for the first time in my life, which was a very powerful experience, and I highly recommend for anybody who has never shaved their head to do it at least once in your life. I shaved my head. I stopped using beauty products. I stopped painting my toenails and fingernails and plugging my eyebrows and everything. And I just, went to bathing with, baking soda and vinegar, just being clean, but not using, lots of perfumes and things like that. I stopped shaving my legs and my armpits. I stopped doing everything that I was taught to do, but didn't know why I was doing it. And I stripped my diet down, well, very naturally, because it kind of happened over time through my yoga practice. Stripped my diet down to a vegetarian and then a vegan diet, which has been off and on over the years, just however I felt at the time. But this particular time, through that experience of, just like stopping all of these societal norms, I took a vow of, we called it a vow of poverty, but also what some might call now, because it's kind of trending, minimalism. Back then there was no term, but we called it a vow of poverty, and wanted to have as few belongings as possible. And so I basically had a rug in my living room, some blankets on the floor that I slept on. My daughter had a normal bedroom because I didn't want to push her to the things that I was practicing in my own life. So, she had a normal bed and toys and things like that. But in the living room, I slept in the living room. I didn't even use the bedrooms in the house. I would wash my clothing by hand in the bathtub. I would cook rice, beans, and avocado for dinner. And I slept in the floor. I had a few books and a mantle that I would meditate at and a yoga mat, and that was basically it. And I lived like that for many years. In that purge, I had taken everything that I owned. I had a big house full of things and put it all on the side of the road except for a few things. Just threw away all of the belongings I had, gave it away really. And it was a beautiful experience for me, just being able to cut all of these ties, all of these things weighing me down, all of these belongings that require maintenance and money and etc. And, that turned into us moving to a different town and opening up this other yoga studio that just absolutely exploded. We began teaching so many classes. I, at some point, began to become tired of hearing my own voice. Being a person who has always been, pretty silent, pretty quiet. Between Billy and myself, we were teaching about 45 hot yoga classes a week. Most people do one a day. So you can only imagine that as a person who didn't really speak a lot, became tired of their own voice very quickly. So upon training a few other teachers to begin working at our studio, Billy and I took some time off, and I took a vow of silence. And that lasted for 9 weeks. I did not speak. I did not teach yoga. I would speak to my daughter. And because I, again, did not want her to ever suffer negative effects from my spiritual journey. So I always have tried to remain soft towards her position. And so a vow of silence for 9 weeks, only speaking to my daughter in private whenever we were alone and visiting. That vow of silence opened up another incredible world of understanding, again, without words. After the first 3 days were very emotional internally, because it's almost like we have this human basic need to communicate and to pour out, to tell people what's going on in here. And then after about 3 days, there's something about a 3-day period of time. But after about 3 days, my mind started getting quiet. And I enjoyed that. My mind became very quiet. And so eventually the vow of silence ended, and I returned to teaching hot yoga. We opened up a second and then a third hot yoga studio in the same area. And then came again to a place of being, very burned out with how much yoga we were teaching. And yoga is not a bad thing, but we were certainly like pushing our energy out there so hard. And it was a beautiful thing. It was a very life-changing, a whole story in its own. But we eventually came to, someone offered to buy our yoga studio, and it felt right to us. And so we sold our yoga studio and took the money and bought a bus and a school bus and converted it into a camper, and began to travel a bit and just take some time off to rest. That rest turned into an invitation to come stay at someone's house while they were traveling, and kind of house sit for them, but to use their space while they were traveling. A group of us were hanging out together one night, and one of them offered to smoke and share with everybody. And not being one who ever partakes in that, and haven't really since, did participate. And in that, the reason I didn't like to participate before was because it always made me feel very weird and anxious. And this time was no different. And I began to not feel good about having participated. And I began to panic and have a hardcore anxiety attack. And so I pulled Billy off to the side, and, I was crying to him saying, like, Billy, I don't like feeling this way. Please take this away from me, knowing the power that Billy has, for lack of a better word. I begged Billy, please take this from me. I don't want to feel this way anymore. And so he said, okay, I'm going to take it from you. And he hugged me and said, I want you to just let go. And he squeezed me really hard and, told me to take a deep breath and exhale. And as I exhaled, he squeezed real hard. And I felt something just lift. And something broke open even deeper than it ever had before. And I didn't feel that feeling anymore. But something else was there. And I told Billy, you didn't take that away. You made me go higher. And at first it was a little scary, but then I just allowed myself to be there. And there was some exuberance, this bright joy that just exploded from my heart. And Billy and I, like little children, just went, dancing and running around the yard. And there was a trampoline, and we got on the trampoline and we jumped for what felt like hours. And that turned into feeling, seeing, and understanding so much about the universe. It felt like that there wasn't anything that I didn't understand or know exactly how it happened, or understanding all of the secrets of the universe. There are a few videos that exist from this period of time, one of which is in Billy's 21-day Mystica Unprogram course. But I would say that was my greatest awakening. And I spent about 2 or 3 weeks in that state, in pure joy, interacting with other beings, including Paramahansa Yogananda, which was an experience in and of itself. Just being full of this brightness. I don't know. It's like everything made sense. And in some sense, one might have said that I was in a state of enlightenment for about 2 weeks. But then I began to have some challenges where I wanted to step away from that, because I wanted to bring people with me. And so I did step away from that and came back into this state and began to experience humanness again. And that's not to say that doesn't still exist. It was a beautiful and profound experience, and there are still things that I remember from that experience that go with me, that move with me through every moment of every day. And certainly there have been many, many, many more profound things to happen since then. That was the summer of 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So that was probably a long answer to a very simple question. But I wanted to share a part of my journey of what led me to where I'm at. And there have been many, many, many more awakenings, but those were the more significant moments. It continues to build and flow with each segment of period of my life. And I'm so happy to be on this journey. I'm so happy to share this journey. And if you've watched this whole video, I appreciate you listening, and I hope that it has added something wonderful to you and your life. I feel like there's so much more that I wish that I could share in a video. I am writing an autobiography about my story, about these stories, and so much more. I think maybe I highlighted 4 significant moments in my life where there have been maybe 80 significant moments of my life, and profound awarenesses that have come, and shifts that have come, and understandings that have come, and I want to share all of them. Of course, that book will be some time away, but I hope that this video suffices until then. I love you, thank you, and namaste.